Surely, at this point, you've seen Imperial Yeast's amazing selection of high-quality brewing yeasts over at imperialyeast.com. But you might not be as familiar with Imperial Yeast's special order yeast bank. In addition to their tried-and-true core strain selection, Imperial Yeast has a number of ale or lager strains, Brettanomyces, Kveik, and other yeasts available for special order. If you're looking to match a yeast strain currently in production, or just looking for something new to play with in the brew house, reach out to Imperial Yeast customer service to see what they may have in store. Special order strains are subject to a 10-liter order minimum and require a 2 to 3 week propagation time, but they might just be what you're looking for your next brew. You can get more information about Imperial Yeast's special order strains by calling 503-477-5826 or emailing customerservice@imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. Like any good chef will tell you, making the best food requires the best ingredients. To brew great beer, you also need to use the highest quality of ingredients like quality malt, hops, yeast, and water. And on the flip side, using bad ingredients will absolutely ruin your beer. If your malt goes bad or if it isn't of suitable quality, why would you want to brew with it? Well, that's the problem that some brewers complained about with respect to blue aleurone barley. I'm your host, Cade Job, and today I'm back in the lab with my co-host, Jordan Folks, as we apply the science from last week's episode, the Malting Barley Blues. Jordan, welcome back to the lab.
I think ingredient quality is really important here, and this was an interesting one for me because malt color is not something I've really necessarily thought too much about as an assessment of the ingredients quality. You know, if you had some pale malt that was like brown because it was, maybe really old or something, I might, turn an eye, but I wouldn't even have known to look at it. Not to mention, it sounds like it might not be even easily accessible to the naked eye. You might have to get underneath the hole or something.
Yeah, right. Like pearl it down a little bit. Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things that I didn't even realize this was a thing until I read the research paper by Dr. Chris Massman and Patrick Hayes, who were, of course, my guest on last week's episode. And, of course, a team of other researchers were also co-authors on that paper. Have you ever brewed with blue barley?
Not to my knowledge, but who knows? I don't know. Is it that common?
I mean, apparently it is actually that common. But like you said, this is a thing that may not even be visible to the naked eye. You've got to actually pearl the barley and strip off the husk. But yeah, it's really interesting to me to think about. I didn't know what blue barley was. And I guess the good news from the episode is that it doesn't seem to make much difference, at least to the quality of your beer or the barley itself. And it won't turn your beer blue, which is great news. So we'll apply the science to what we learned in this episode. And we're also going to cover some of the topics from an earlier episode with Dr. Pat Hayes, which was episode 36, where we talked about barley basics, because I do think it plays a role in understanding why brewers would even care about blue aleurone barley and how they went about testing some of the quality parameters that they looked at in this episode. But first, if you're not already a patron of Brewlosophy, please consider becoming one. We really appreciate the support that we get from all of our patrons, and as a reward for your support, you get rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, an invite to a monthly live Q&A session, and that's in addition to all of the other great content that we continue to provide for free. The Experiment series on the website, 2 podcasts, the new Brewlosophy show on YouTube. We're able to keep doing all of this awesome content because of our amazing patrons. So seriously, if you're not a patron, I'd really love for you to become one. All the information you need is at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links at brewlosophy.com/support. Just start your shopping experience by clicking on those links and we get a small kickback. Every little bit helps and it doesn't change your shopping experience at all. And again, you can find all of our affiliate links at brewlosophy.com/support. This week's feedback is brought to you by the team at Haas, who are constantly innovating to provide solutions to your brewing problems. We've all had hazy IPAs, and since you're listening to this show, you know that getting a stable haze can be a challenge. Imagine you've brewed this awesome hazy IPA, you added your whirlpool and dry hops, it's looking great while fermenting and then drops crystal clear after you crash it. Well, the folks at Haas have you covered. Introducing Hop Haze, their newest brewing product. Hop Haze can be used in post-fermentation to add a stable hazy complexion to beer and other beverages. It's 100% hop-derived, flavorless in beer and requires no additional mixing before use, and the haze stability is the same as the shelf life of your beer. So if you want to achieve that juicy look in your next hazy IPA, be sure to try Hop Haze. And also check out all of Haas's other innovative products at johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, H-A-A-S.com. All right, listener Greg wrote in. He said, "Hi, Cade. I wanted to write in after listening to the Brew Lab episode 109 regarding thiols." I think that was in Applying the Science with you, Jordan. And it says, this topic is what I've been focusing on in my brewing, and I try to listen to and read any bit of thiol-related science and news I can. Thank you for putting this out there. I almost exclusively brew hazy New England-style IPA or double IPA. Over the last couple of years, I've been brewing a lot with omega thiolized yeast strains and Phantasm thiol powder, so much so that my homebrew club basically expects that this is what I'm bringing to our club meetings. I've had very positive results and have even won a couple silver medals at competitions with thiolized beers. I started with using Cosmic Punch and doing some mash and first wort hopping. I rarely do any real hot kettle additions, mostly just mash hop, maybe a first wort, then whirlpool and dry hop. I tend to like the bitterness quality of those earlier hop additions. I do that as a study in survivables as well, to load the wort with any precursor bound up in those hops. I've had good luck with Cascade, Chinook, and Centennial in the mash, and may try Zotz next. Using Phantasm, I started on the low end of the dosing spectrum, then increased the whirlpool amount with each batch to see the impact. I've experienced flavors and aromas from overripe tropical to sharp citrus and heavy white wine grape notes. I've found that the white wine grape flavor comes through at higher dosing rates and can overpower whatever else is going on. Many of the recent articles to come out on thiols talk about a less is more approach, and I'm finding that I agree with that, although it can be hard to resist the American more is more philosophy. I really enjoy Omega's Heliogazer yeast. It has such a unique aroma that I get consistently in my homebrew batches and in commercial beers that I've tried. Let me tell you, the first time I tried a commercially produced beer with Heliogazer, after brewing several batches of my own and it smelled the same, I was totally stoked. I don't fully understand all the science, but I enjoy using these products to create fun, flavorful, aromatic beers, and thanks again for providing all of this content. I look forward to it every week. Cheers, Greg. Well, what do you think, Jordan? Heliogazer, I don't know. Have you ever used that yeast?
I have not used Helioglazer, and clearly Greg enjoys thiolized beers, and that's really cool to hear. And it's nice to hear from someone that has way more experience than we do on the subject. I think in that last episode I mentioned that I thought that maybe there was a point of no return where it's just no longer a pleasurable experience. It's nice to hear someone that's really playing around in this space also agrees that bigger isn't necessarily better, as well as this comment on the Phantasm that I had mentioned that I thought I was getting some grape, but didn't know if it was in my head. So it's good to hear that maybe it wasn't just in my head and that the grape powder can produce some grape flavor.
Absolutely. And you also asked that question about, mash hopping or first wort hopping, and the survivability of these thiol compounds. And I think we both commented that we expected them kind of to survive all the way through. It's interesting to hear that Greg's not even using a bittering addition. He's just using, a first wort or a mash hop is going to be a bittering addition, but not, like a formal hot kettle addition. He's just putting it in there in the mash and first wort. And maybe that's creating or extracting more of those thiols. I think you suggested that as well as an option for increasing thiol character in your beer. So cool, Greg. Thanks for writing this in, and thanks for listening to the show. All right, after this short break, we'll be back talking about blue aleurone barley and barley basics. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. When I heard about blue aleurone barley, the first question that popped into my head was, does it turn the beer blue? And I was happy to find out that no, it does not, in fact, turn the beer blue, and actually doesn't seem to have much of an impact on beer at all, right, Jordan?
I was actually disappointed it didn't turn the beer blue.
Right?
As long as it makes a good tasting beer, that'd have been kind of a fun little ingredient.
Oh, man, yeah. If you could just add some extra malt and turn your beer blue, like totally naturally, that would have been really awesome. But yeah, I mean, it is what it is. The blue aleurone barley didn't turn the beer blue, but it was interesting because the whole impetus of this study was brewers like I don't know how they saw this, right? Because they did mention, both Chris and Pat mentioned that like if the husk is on the barley, you'd never know that there's this blue aleurone layer in the barley itself. You never even know it was there. You have to actually do some work to, grind off the husk and like polish it down a little bit before you even like really see this bright blue character. And I know we're in a podcast, so I can't show you any pictures, but if you have access to the ASBC article and you can go and look at those pictures online, I'd highly encourage it because it's really interesting. You can see it actually does look blue. It looks like somebody dyed a barley kernel blue when you get down to this aleurone layer. I mean, that's never something that I've experienced or even something I would have thought to look for in beer, unless the beer itself turned blue, which I've never experienced.
Yeah, I mean, at the homebrew level, I'm not paying that much attention to malt other than, buying the stuff that I like, and you open the bag and you use it. With hops, I always make sure to rub them between my fingers and make sure it smells good. And with malt, I have a lot of trust and just throw it in the mill and into the mash.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm not doing anything as a home brewer like with those. I'm certainly not, grinding up malt and looking at it. But maybe these breweries have a quality, assurance program, which makes sense, right? Especially if you're a big brewery, you're gonna want to assess every single lot that comes in because you're gonna need to make a decision about whether to brew with that lot of barley, and if it's gross or if it's bad or if it's moldy at the worst, right? I think that was one of the comments they said is like the blue aleurone layer kind of makes it look like mold in the barley if it gets all mixed up. But anyway, somebody saw this blue aleurone layer and was like, I'm not brewing with that. And apparently it created a stink in the barley industry. But it was great that Pat and the team, Chris, Harmony, everybody that was involved in this project. There were multiple layers and multiple people involved in this project, and it was a pretty wide and deep study. There were lots of different barley varieties that were included. And ultimately the big takeaway from this is, hey, don't be blue about blue aleurone barley. There's really nothing that's gonna taint your beer or change any of your malt quality or anything like that. So I really appreciated that big takeaway.
So often with scientific studies, with statistical testing, we're looking for a significant difference. And it's nice when you have the opposite, where you actually were hoping not to find one, because we can still publish those results and there could be a lot to learn from the cases where there is no significant difference.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think the interesting thing too was there were a lot of popular varieties in this study that actually had blue aleurone. I think it's very likely that you and I, Jordan, have brewed with these blue aleurone barleys and we just never knew it, right? I mean, I was listening to Chris talk about, I think I asked Chris like evolutionarily, like why would some of them be blue and some of them be white. And he just said, there's this, the darker color kind of protects, the inside of the seed and just like, protects it from light. And I guess that kind of makes sense, but it sounds like there's white barleys out there. There's blue barleys out there. And then there's a whole gradient of barley in between. I think that was one of the things they said that they were looking at, why they used the spectrophotometer and all this other sort of advanced technique to look at it, is because when they got down and started polishing these varieties, it was very hard to tell, like, when does blue start and when does white start? I mean, there were some that were very clearly on the opposite ends, but most of the barley varieties are somewhere in the middle of this gradient. And I guess another thing too that just kind of like keeps popping into my head when I think about this show is it's just like I mean, who found out that some of these barleys were blue? And I want to hear the story of the brewer that realized like, hey, this is blue and I'm not brewing with it. I want to know more about that study because it's got to be interesting, right? Or maybe it's not. Maybe it's super boring. Maybe it is. It's just like they were testing their barley. They started getting this blue, whenever they were looking at it, and they just like went back to their maltster and were like, what's up with the blue? And the maltster was like, I don't know what you're talking about or something. I mean, who knows? Maybe it's just a very like benign story. But in any event, they did genetic testing. They looked at, the genome of the different types of barleys. They did parental control tests to alleviate variation. And they looked at a huge number of barleys that were inside of the OSU barley breeding program. And I think they could say pretty confidently that we don't have to worry about the malting barley blues. If it's blue aleurone or white aleurone, it's still going to make great beer, which I think was a great takeaway.
And they found that it was okay in terms of like brewing quality, malting quality, and also agronomics and like growing efficiency and quality, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they didn't look at brewing quality necessarily. I mean, I'm not sure that they brewed beers with the blue aleurone, if I remember correctly, but they definitely looked at all it meets all of the malting specs. It meets all of the quality specs that they would look for from a barley variety that's going to be malted, and then they malted it, and it matched all of the specs of what a malted variety should look like. So again, it's meeting all the specs that a brewer would need it to meet, and there was just no difference between blue and white whenever they looked at all the different quality specs and parameters and everything. So I mean, I think again they didn't. It's at least my understanding they didn't put the barley in beer, but again, a lot of these barley varieties are super prominent. Like some of them are the CDC varieties in Canada that have blue aleurone in it, and like we've been brewing with these and we've been using these. It's just nobody ever scrubs off the husk, and looks at the barley to see if it's blue or white.
Yeah, only if we knew someone that could actually like brew two side by side and then do like a triangle test or something to compare a difference.
Yeah, of course, that would be really interesting. I'd be shocked if there was a sensory difference, and I think that's kind of the sense that Pat and Chris had as well, is that, look, I mean, you're these barley are just meeting all of the same criteria. It'd be kind of crazy to think that they would have some difference. And I think the key is here, too. I think we've all brewed with blue aleurone barley, and we just don't know it. I mean, again, some of those Malting varieties are the most popular, or some of the most popular varieties that are grown in the United States. So I'm sure they're mixed in somewhere with Great Western or with Breese or any, if you've brewed with a 2-row pale ale, just American 2-row pale malt, you've probably brewed with a mixture of blue or white or just all blue, all white, who knows. But anyway, I mean, that was kind of an interesting study just to like, okay, wow, this is a thing that I didn't know a thing. Could this be a thing? And then dive into it and figure out like, okay, no, it's not a thing. But one of the things that was really important, wow, I said thing like 8 times there. If this is a drinking game, you're getting drunk. But one of the things that was important throughout the show was this idea of assessing malt quality, right? Because that's kind of the whole impetus for why they did this study in the first place. Is a brewer ostensibly looked at this and said, hey, I'm not brewing with this malt because it's a weird color. And so I thought we should spend some time talking about like assessing malt and maybe focus on it sort of as a homebrew, from a homebrewer's perspective. Because I think, there's a lot of commercial brewing practices out there where they're looking at and assessing ingredients. I don't know a whole lot about that myself. I can just talk about my homebrewing experiences. So I think I'd like to stay there. And one of the things that Pat talked about during the show was that different malt quality is all the different malt quality parameters that barley has to meet in order to be malting barley quality. It was like a huge list of things. There's like moisture, and there's like, growth, germinative capacity, and like water content and water stability, and all these crazy things. Not crazy, I'm sure they have a use, but all of these things. And my first takeaway is always like, wow, it seems like the American Barley Association is really, really strict, I'm always like, wow, this just seems like a lot. But I've got a question for you, Jordan. As a home brewer, how do you determine whether or not to brew with a malt? Like, do you do any sort of quality analyses or assessments of your malt?
I mean, some things I would be concerned about is making sure that it's reasonably fresh. So, if someone was like, hey, I used to homebrew in the 80s and I found this like bag of crushed malt, do you want it? I would not be interested. And so one thing you hear is patronize homebrew stores with good turnover. If there's like this beer store in Portland that's got like 10,000 beers or something, and they're all old because you can't sell 10,000 beers reliably, right? And so there's probably a bit of a balancing act a homebrew store has to play in that regard. Is they can't stock too many malts, or in a given one of them is not going to be selling that quickly. So making sure it's not offensively old. Me personally, I have my own mill, so I'm not really interested in acquiring pre-crushed grains. I would think that crushing them the day before you brew is probably fine, but I'm not buying pre-crushed stuff and shipping across the country and holding on to it for a whole long time. I think that Marshall actually did a study on brewlosophy, and I think he found that it wasn't that big of a deal in that particular example. But still, me personally, I guess freshness is like the one quality that I try to be somewhat reasonably confident on.
Yeah, that's this interesting idea, right? That fresh is best. I mean, we've talked about, I at least I've talked about that a lot with a bunch of different people about like, you know, old hops, or old in air quotes, hops that have been sitting in your freezer in a vacuum sealed bag or under nitrogen for 2 years, right? Is there anything that's different about those hops than fresh hops that are just out of the field that have only been in your freezer for 30 days or 40 days, right? Is there actually going to be a difference? And you're right. Marshall did do that study where he crushed up some barley and put it in his garage for like, I don't remember how long, 6 or 7 months. It was several months. And then used that barley with a batch that was freshly milled, and there was no significant difference in that. But, you know, I do think that's right? Some people, for most people, brewing with fresh ingredients generally is a better idea. That's why, you know, if you get into commercial brewing practices, they have all this like first in, first out, or like last in, first out. There's all these inventory management practices that are really important, especially as you get up to a bigger brewery, because you don't want things disappearing in a back corner, right? Or like sitting back there. And one of the reasons why is because barley itself, if it gets subjected to moisture, it's going to start molding, right? It's going to start growing. That aleurone layer, which has all the enzymatic package or kicks off the enzymatic package, is going to start that barley growing. And that's gross. I mean, nobody wants to brew with moldy barley. I can't even imagine what that would taste like or why you would want to do that. But I mean, if you came back in there, if the malt is like clumpy, that's happened a time or two where I found like an old malt bag in the back of my, you know, when I stored malts in my garage. I don't do that anymore. But when I stored malts in my garage, like you find this like moldy bag that's just been like sitting back there, or like a clumpy, like that's the kind of the first sign too. And it's not necessarily like moldy, but malt should like run through your fingers really easily. It should like just sift through your fingers. And then also there's another one too. If the malt starts getting chewy and springy, like I don't know about you, Jordan, but that's something that I do pretty much every time I brew beer. Mostly because I don't know, I'm just like snacking on things, but I like chew the malt a little bit while I'm like, you know, about to mill it. I'll just like grab a little handful, like 2 or 3 kernels, and like throw them into my and chew on them a little bit. And they should be like brittle and hard, like hard candy. They shouldn't be chewy and springy. If they're soft and chewy and easy to chew, something is wrong. Spit that malt out. don't eat it. You know, but like these are just sort of some like obvious physical characteristics that I look for. Is there anything else obvious that you look for in malt?
I mean, also, you don't want any exogenous actors in there, like rat infestation inside box of malt or whatever. And so, you know, like you said, we just want to try to keep these things dry and sealed away and use them fairly fresh. And I think that malt is a lot more forgiving than hops. You know, we're not vac sealing these and holding them in the freezer and trying to use them within, 12 months of harvest date. I think that there's a little bit more wiggle room here. So I'm curious, how long can malt be stored for? Is there a rule of thumb? 3 years, 2 years? What do you know?
I mean, I think most brewers in that 2 to 3 year range, right? That they won't use malt that's been stored longer than 2 or 3 years. But honestly, if it's in a cool and dark, dry place away from, like you said, pests, especially like rats or like mold or anything, and as long as it's not subject to like huge temperature changes, where it's like really hot and then it's like really cold, I would think it'll last for a really long time. I mean, it's dried down to a really low moisture content. I mean, if you're looking at, a malt COA, there's not a lot of moisture in that beer or in that malt. I mean, it's dried like well down as it's kilned. That's kind of the whole point, so that it can be shipped across, the United States or across the world. And I think that's kind of the important key, right? Dry, away from pests, and then you can store it from a long time. I've got some malts that, like, for example, I got a 55-pound bag of honey malt. I don't know, 2 or 3, maybe 5 years ago. I've still got it, and I still brew with it occasionally. Every now and then I'm like, you know what? I need to use a handful of this. So I'll just go and grab a handful and like throw it in. So I'm like, I got to use this. I got to get rid of it.
Yeah. That's why as a home brewer, I don't buy bags of specialty malts. I'll buy Vienna or Munich takes me long enough to go through a bag of that. So typically just buying pale base malts at the bag level. Anything like that, I would just be buying on demand.
Yeah, I wish I could. So I used to have in Austin, I was close to homebrew shops where I could go and get specialty malts really quickly. And in Corvallis, we had a homebrew shop, but unfortunately it's closed due to COVID and also just retiring. The guy who owned it was just ready to be done. But in any event, I don't have a local place. The closest place for me is now in Salem or in Eugene, which is about an hour from where I live, to go and get specialty malts. So I'm shopping on more beer. I'm also, when I have the occasion to drive over there, it's nice to do that. But for a while there, I did. For a while there, I was brewing like every 2 weeks or so, and I was like cranking through specialty malts. So I got some things that I was using pretty frequently. Honey malt being one of those things that I bought, and I was like, okay, yeah, I'm going to use this, and then I didn't like it, so I just didn't use it very much. But do you throw out malts that you don't like or that you don't use, or you just don't keep very many malts on hand?
Yeah, I don't think that I've really kept anything at a large enough volume that I'm using rarely enough for it to age super long. But, I've got some Vienna malt that I've had for a year or two, but it's kept, in the Vittel vault, and I'll use it until it's gone. But I haven't experimented with holding any grains back for 10 years or anything like that.
Yeah. All right. So I've got a really big question for you. And this is, I think, one that you'll be interested in answering. Is malt assessment something that a home brewer should even really be worried about?
Maybe not. I think that if they're selling it to you, it should really be of reasonable quality already. If there was a homebrew store that was really suspect and they were just never selling product and they've had the same bag since the 80s, maybe I wouldn't use it. But I think generally speaking, you're probably going to be pretty safe.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, yes, you should be worried about obvious things, right? Like if you walk into the homebrew store, or if the homebrew store's totally open and it's 95 degrees in Texas and humid outside, and they've got bags of malt laying there, yeah, you might want to be like, oh, wait. This, I don't know that I want to use this. But again, like you said, if the malt is stored reasonably well and there's no obvious physical debris in it, I think malting quality isn't usually something that homebrewers have to worry about. Breweries, on the other hand, absolutely is totally subjected to different stressors, right? I mean, that malt is delivered on pallets on a truck, and maybe who knows where it's stored until it gets room inside the brewery. There's space management and all sorts of things that a brewer has to worry about. And like you mentioned, rats. Right? I mean, that's why brewery cats are a thing. It's not because cats are cute and brewers want them around. It's because, no, there's rats, right? Or at least that's how it started. Maybe it's a thing now. I don't know. I never had a brewery cat. But rats are a big deal, and you don't want rats to get in your bag. I mean, I've heard all kinds of stories about maltsters, like, opening up a bag of malt, getting ready to dump it in the mill, and like 10 rats just like jump out of the bag. I mean, if that happened to me, I'd like flip out. I'd be like, nope, gone.
Yeah. Screw that. But yeah, I think ultimately malt's one of the hardiest ingredients we use. It's really the other two main ingredients that you need to be worried about at a homebrew store. Are they storing their liquid yeast on the shelf next to the books? Do they have
God, I hope not.
Giant bags of hops in a trash bag that they scoop out with a pitcher and then pour into, a plastic sack and hand it to you? Like, these kind of things, I'm sure there's examples of it out there. And so it seems like malt is going to be a little bit of a safer item.
Yeah. And one other thing I would say too about like your homebrew shop, I wouldn't be too worried about using their mill, right, to grind your malts. I don't think you have to invest in a mill in order to have good quality beer. I think, this is something that we should talk about before we go to the break. I think one of the things about a mill that if you own at home, is you can change and improve your efficiency if you care about things like efficiency. That's, to me, one of the biggest things about having a mill at home, changing your grain crush size so that you can play around with that if you want to. But I wouldn't worry about using the mill at the homebrew shop, even though, yeah, sure, there's grain that's still on there and you might get a couple kernels in your grain. That was one of those things that I was like super worried about whenever I first started brewing. Like, look, there's all this like grain dust on there. And like, what if somebody just used some chocolate malt and I'm about to brew an American standard lager, am I going to get a weird color in there? No, I've never really seen any of that come through. I mean, obviously just look at it and make sure it's okay. And that it's doing a good job of milling and crushing your grain. But don't worry about it. And if your grain is crushed somewhere else and shipped to you, you can still make great beer with that. I'm not really one of those people that buys into, you have to invest in a mill and get it done at your house. To me, that adds a step, right? Is like I've got a mill also on brew day, which doesn't take that long, but it takes long enough to measure out the ingredients and mill it on brew day, amidst all the other things that you're doing. But efficiency, I did want to talk about efficiency because that is one thing that you can see in terms of malt quality. If your malt is poorly stored, like for my example, when I was storing malt in my garage in Texas, it's not necessarily, I guess it's humid in my garage, but it's not necessarily like dank or anything in there or damp. But it was hot and there were high changes in temperature, right? So it'd get hot and it'd get cold, hot and cold, hot and cold. And I do think that started to affect my efficiency. You start to see efficiency go down, even though I'm increasing or decreasing my mill gap using finer and finer crush. Efficiency goes down and down. And that's a couple of different things. Who knows? It could actually be something that's growing in the malt itself. And it could also just be that malt is getting soft and pliable, and that it's just gummy, right? And then you're not actually cracking and turning the starches into flour so that they can be extracted by the yeast. So that's something to keep an eye on. If you're having efficiency problems, check your equipment first. Don't blame the ingredient, but check how you're storing and your malt quality and stuff. I don't know. Have you ever had problems with efficiency in terms of malt quality or malt assessment?
Not to that level, but I do take a pretty big hit to my efficiency when I use wheat malt. Why is that, by the way?
I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure. I don't know that I've ever noticed an efficiency for wheat malt. Who knows?
Yeah, the big things that impact my efficiency at home is the use of wheat malt, and even a little bit. I just don't get the same gravity points per gallon or whatever that I do when I use all barley malt. And then also a step mash versus a single infusion or versus decoction. I definitely get different efficiencies related to the mashing regime.
Yeah, sure. I bet with the step mash being higher and more efficient, right? I'm guessing.
And then decoction being the most efficient. But a part of it is you're literally boiling some of the liquid off. And so there's a bit of a function there too.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. You're concentrating everything. So it's not really like a 1-to-1 efficiency calculation. Yeah. All right. Well, I think we talked enough about assessing malt quality. Let's take a quick break and we'll come back talking about some different malt quality factors that are found on the COA and how Jordan and I use those in our own brewing practices. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
There's a lot of information on a malt COA. Things like diastatic power, friability, beta-glucans, moisture, fine grind extract, coarse grind extract, etc. And first of all, Jordan, I guess, do you ever even look at a malt COA when you buy malt from the store?
Never, not once.
I was wondering if that was going to be the case. I have looked at a malt COA before as a home brewer, but I feel like only recently, because I was just like, at some point, like there was some level that was like, I don't even know what I'm buying, right? Like I've got this recipe out here and I'm like, okay, yeah, it says add 10.1 pounds or like 10 pounds of two-row. But how do I know that I'm actually supposed to add 10 pounds of two-row? I mean, like, am I actually going to hit my numbers if I add 10 pounds of two-row or am I going to be like high or low, you know? And so at some point I was like, maybe I should look at a COA.
Yeah, it's funny because we do adjust our, or at least I do, the alpha acid based on the predicted loss associated with the hop age. And, you know, when you're typing in the number and you're doing the conversion, you don't actually know what month it was harvested, but we have a general idea, but not a lot of homebrewers are looking at the COA to adjust the predicted points per gallon or whatever the metric is and modifying their efficiency calculations accordingly.
Yeah, right. I mean, this is one of those things too that whenever I first, got like into classes, I would say about like beer and brewing, or like started deeply like trying to read through, calculating a recipe from scratch. I guess I don't know if you've read Ray Daniels' Designing Great Beers. But there's a whole bunch of chapters in there about calculating from scratch your entire recipe. So, looking at a malt COA and going from coarse grind extract or fine grind extract to how many gravity points you're actually going to get in a beer. And the calculation's not terribly difficult. It's not easy, but it's not terribly difficult. It takes some time and some practice. And so if you want to know those things, you're welcome to read through those chapters in the book. But I started thinking about that. Okay, the reason why I was reading Ray Daniels in the first part was it's called Designing Great Beers. So I wanted to like improve my recipe design. And there's all of this stuff in there that's like, here's how you calculate the extract. But I wanted to step back up for a minute and ask you sort of like from a macro level before we get down into like those details. How do you choose what malt is going to go into the recipe? Like, how do you, like, I'm talking about like type of malt. How do you even choose which malts are even going to go into your recipe?
Yeah, I think that more experimentation is needed on this, but I tend to gravitate towards the country of origin for the ingredient relative to the style I'm trying to make. So German beers, I'm using German malts. If I was to brew British beers, which I don't, I would use British malts, so on and so forth. I will say that the American beer styles that are out there seem to be the most forgiving, that you can totally use German malts and a like German Pilsner and American IPA, and it's not going to taste like a German IPA. But it does not seem to go the other way around. That if you want a truly authentic tasting Helles, Great Western Two Rows not going to get you there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's kind of how I've done it too, or at least maybe, I would look at like somebody else's recipe first and go like, okay, what does a traditional German Pils have in it? It's got Pils malt. Go figure, right? That makes sense. But I have recently started expanding out the difference between like Pils and Pale. And there's two reasons for that. One, I've talked a lot on the Brewlosophy show on the Brewlosophy podcast, about my Kolsch recipe. And several iterations of that Kolsch recipe, I ran out of Pils malt or pale malt. And I'm like, crap, I'm brewing a Kolsch today, and I forgot to buy pale malt. So I've substituted those two things.
Yeah, recently I made a international pale lager. It's actually featured on the website as the impact of yeast pitch rate, where we compared a lager pitch rate versus an ale pitch rate in an international pale lager. And on brew day, I discovered, oh no, I'm out of Pilsner malt. And I didn't want to like leave the house. And I was just like, you know what? I've got two-row. I'm sure there's been a Brewlosophy experiment demonstrating that two-row was not distinguishable from a Pilsner malt. Sure enough, it wasn't. And I just gave it a go. And sure enough, that beer went on to win a medal in the first round of NHC and is going on to the finals. And so you can make a good lager, in this case, ostensibly a European lager, using Great Western two-row. So it can be done.
Heck yeah, an experiment beer actually going on to NHC. That's pretty incredible, the National Homebrew Competition here. That's pretty amazing, because those beers aren't, I mean, they're not brewed to be bad beers. Nobody likes to drink bad beer, but they're not brewed to be like medal-winning competition beers.
Speak for yourself.
Okay, yeah, maybe I just brew shit beer. But this is the thing, right? Like on my Kolsch, like there have been a couple of occasions where I've just brewed that thing with pale malt or Pilsner malt, and I don't care, right? It's gonna both taste good. So I guess my point here in asking like, how do you choose the type of malt there? You didn't hear Jordan or I say, oh, we're choosing the type of malt based on the highest amount of extract that we can get out of it, or based on its S/T ratio, or any of those things, right? For home brewers, you're not really interested in those things as much, right? The amount of extract that you're going to get out of the beer. But for a commercial brewer, that stuff really matters. I mean, you can take the macro guys off the table for a minute, but even look at something like Sierra Nevada Pale, right? That's supposed to hit a target ABV, and it's shipped all over the country. And if you're not keying into or hitting your gravity numbers, then that's going to cause big downstream problems for you. Or if you have to change a malt supplier, right? If you got to change a malt supplier and get a different malt, or your maltster starts changing something in their malting process and you're expecting to hit this number and you're not hitting it, those are huge problems for big breweries. So it's a really big deal. But you don't hear us as home brewers saying like we need extract, right? Or at least I didn't hear you say that. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I don't hear you saying that you're interested in the maximizing the amount of extract to get out of your malts.
No, yeah. I mean, I just kind of assume it's all equal enough. And it's okay if I come out at 1049 instead of 1048 or 1050 or whatever, it's all good at the homebrew level. And that's one of the fun things about it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Now, what I do care about, though, is flavor. Like you said, I'm sure, right? You were even talking about the blue and white aleurone, right? They didn't do a sensory test, and so maybe they should do a sensory test on this. But different flavors are interesting to me. And while one manufacturer's Pils malt might taste the same as its pale malt to me, I do notice differences between maltsters, and especially between what I would call like big maltsters and the craft maltsters. Like there's a difference between Mecca Grade and Briess, and they're not. That's not to say that one is better than the other, right? Difference doesn't mean better or worse. It just means that they're different. I noticed across all of Mecca Grade's malt that there's this like grainy sort of hay-like character that I really like, and that's something that I want in my beers, and one of the reasons why I like Mecca Grade's malts. But if I'm trying to make something crisp and clean without that character, then I gotta use something different, because I find that character through all of their malts. I mean, it's like what I understand from Admiral Malts is floor malting, barley. Like all their barleys, or at least most of their barleys, are floor malted, or at least they emphasize floor malting, and they believe that has a flavor impact. So when you buy a pale malt from them, it actually is made in a different process. So I think there are differences in flavors from different maltsters, and that is something that I care about as a home brewer, as I'm sure you do too, Jordan.
Yeah, and that's where experience comes in. There's so many malts out there now, and as a home brewer, you can only make so many beers in a year, right, or a lifetime for that matter. And so I think that's one of those never-ending journeys that it's not realistic that we're ever going to really understand the nuances of every malt product that's out there, and that's what's fun. And I really like German Weyermann Barca Pils, but I don't shy away from other ones because I'm excited to try other malts. And so I just got a bag of a Czech malt, a variety I've never even heard of. I can't even pronounce the name. F.H. Steinbart hooked it up, and I'm super excited to play around with it. And it's just a really fun part of the brewing hobby, because you can't really get into the differences on hops like that. You can have a Mosaic hop or a Citra hop, but at least at the homebrew level, you can't try Washington-grown Citra versus Lot 72 Oregon-grown Citra, right? It's it kind of just is what it is.
Yeah. I mean, exactly right. And I think, to some extent, for a long time, the whole idea of malt and hops was this, we're just getting sugar out of malt, and we're just getting bitterness out of hops. So for a long time, there was no reason to differentiate between, where a malt was produced or where a hop was produced or any of those things. I think we're starting to see some of that with the terroir research that's coming out in hops, and some of the barley variety flavor research that's coming out of Pat Hayes' lab with Campbell Morrissey and Harmony Bettenhausen and those folks, talking about how the individual barley variety flavor carries through the beer. But you're right, from a homebrew level, I don't think most people are trying to look at the malt COA to see which lot number that this came from and rejecting it if it was from some lot. I mean, there's just no way that you could ever get to that level as a maltster. But that Barca Pils, that's one of those that I hear people talk about all the time. I've never actually brewed with it, but I hear people say if you're into brewing German beers and you're not using Barca, then you are doing something wrong.
It's awesome. It's really full. It's like hearty. It's got so much malt character. I absolutely love it. And I think that it's kind of like the polar opposite of something like a Heidelberg Pils from Best Smalls. That thing is so light. There's just, nothing's there. And it's really nice for like a rice lager or something where you don't want any malt character. Just like, give me a little bit of yellow and, let's get on to the clean fermentation character, maybe some hops. Barca Pils is a wonderful choice for a Helles or any sort of like malty lager. You should seriously give it a try.
Yeah. And I'm excited to. I would love to try some Barca. Maybe I'll try to find that next time I'm looking for Pils. I'm stocked on Pils right now. I got a couple of sacks of Pelton, Mecha Grades Pelton sitting in my brewery right now. But I will try it at some point. One other thing from a malt COA that actually might be interesting to home brewers is color, right? Because that's one of the reasons why we're adding different malts like caramel malts or roasted malts, especially the roasted malts, right? You might be trying to get some bitterness from it, but oftentimes I'm just adding in like 1 to 2% of roasted malt to get a color. For example, like in a Munich or in a Vienna style lager, right? I might actually brew that with like 98% Pils and 2% roasted and no Vienna to get the color that I want from a Vienna malt. I'm curious about you. I know I don't do it, but I'm curious. Do you ever look at the Lovabond ratings on a COA when you're buying your malt, or are you just kind of trusting the brew shop? And if they say caramel 10 or whatever, then you're getting 10.
No, yeah, I just look at whatever the package says. And I do look at that, and maybe I'll adjust it in my Brewfather software. Maybe I won't, like if it's 1.7 versus 2.2 for a pale malt, it's like, who cares? But at the homebrew level, right? If you're Budweiser and you're trying to make this beer look the same every time too, I could totally see how they could adjust that. But me, I've got this weird mental hang up with like odd numbers. And when it comes to brewing, even though I totally could do 2.1 pounds, it's always 2 or 2.5 or, 2.5. I don't like an odd number. So it's kind of against my brewing ethos to adjust things really minutely just to like hit some sort of ideal number that doesn't really matter anyways.
That's why you've got to start brewing in grams, because then if you adjust to like 5 or 0, you're only changing it like 5 grams or 10 grams, which is like nothing. Instead of like, a half a pound or a quarter pound of malt. That can be quite a bit of a difference there. That's why you got to start brewing in grams. No, but I bring up color because everybody that's using a brewing software is doing a color calculation, right? And you're in Brewfather, whenever you type a recipe in, it spits out what color the estimate is based on the malts that are already installed into Brewfather. And like you, I will occasionally change something that's like way off, right? If there's something that like I know this is an extra light, Pilsner malt, and it's only like 1.2 or 1.3 Lovabond or something, and then the category that I'm choosing because I can't find this malt in Brewfather is like 2.5. I would change that, right? So it's like, okay, this is actually what the color is going to be, and this is representative of the malt that I brewed. But for the most part, yeah, I'm not looking too much into this. There's other things on a malt COA like fine grind extract, friability, S over T, fan, beta glucan content, all of this stuff. For a home brewer, any of those things interesting to you, Jordan?
Only the conversations we've had on this podcast related to the science behind them. But when it comes to actually applying it on my brew day, I really don't care. And maybe I should, I don't know. And part of it is like, I kind of only make pale beers. So it's just like, I'm just trying to get the malt character and then the malt sugars. I'm not super concerned with the other, pieces of the puzzle for my brewing practices.
Yeah, I would say the same thing too, right? Like I'm not changing much on a malt COA from my home brewing practices, but you bring up the show and not to like toot my own horn for the show, but there are things in the show that I've been like, oh, maybe I should pay a little bit more attention to this. And one of those is like, now I've stopped thinking about malt. I used to originally think about the malting process as, this is just, a flavor thing. I mean, it is a flavor thing. There's a component of that, but so much of it is that enzyme package too, right? Like outside of like the specialty malts, like caramel malt, roasted malts where you're just like totally like barbecuing the grain and destroying the enzymes, pale malt, Pilsner malt, the differences between, the lightly kilned malts. I'm looking at that modification thing as like this S over T ratio of like, oh, how modified is this malt? And I'm wondering, because we've talked about it a couple times on the show, this idea of protein content, right? How malts are increasing in their protein content. And I think I've mentioned on the show, I don't really know why that is. I think you've mentioned on the show, you don't really know why that is changing malt quality. Maybe I can get somebody on the show to talk about that. And FAN, that's the other one, like free amino nitrogen. Those two things are super important to commercial brewers. But as a home brewer, I've never started to look at them. But I am starting to look at modification level, and part of me just thinks I should also look at extract too, even though I've never really looked at that one either.
Yeah, and so why do we care about FAN?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, right? I don't know. That would, like, protein and FAN, those are the two that I don't know why we care about. I got to get a commercial brewer on. Maybe I can reach out to somebody, one of our commercial brewer friends, and see if we can get them on to talk about FAN and protein and just like deep dive into that. But I do think commercial brewers have a little bit of a different need there than home brewers. Like you said, I mean, most home brewers, if you're doing 10 or 10 and a half, and those for malt, it doesn't really matter. Like you said, if you hit 1045 or 1050, or you hit 4 or 5, I mean, if you're way off in your gravity, then you care, but that's more just probably a process issue than anything about like the malt itself, right? You're not going to go back and adjust the malt COA in Brewfather because you missed your numbers, right?
Well, yeah, and on the production side, there's not only true to brand, trying to replicate things, and also just maximizing efficiency in the brew house. And I mean that both specifically in the brewing, mashing efficiency, but also just like general production efficiency. That all really matters to them. At the homebrew level, it can be, we don't need to go 10.1 pounds if based on the COA. We just do 10. But beyond that, there's one other thing that pro brewers have to worry about that we don't, which is shelf stability. We're not putting these things in cans and sending them across the country that may or may not sit hot in a warehouse before it goes into a grocery store that may or may not be refrigerated, and then maybe it's pulled out and it's on a in case and then it's hot again. These kind of things that homebrewers aren't realistically putting their beers through the ringer like that. And I think that some of these COA things probably have downstream effects that production breweries that are putting things in can and sending out the door might have to think about that we just don't care about.
Yeah, that actually sparks something in my head, that FAN. The more FAN, the higher FAN content that can cause issues with stability as the beer ages. So maybe that's something, and one of the reasons why brewers are really interested in monitoring and adjusting their free amino nitrogen levels. But it is interesting, right? And some of these things are important for like the mashing process. Other things are important for the lautering process, like the beta glucan content. I mean, that was something that was really interesting to me too, that we learned on this study that you and I have discussed, is this idea that beta glucans, we've always talked about them as having an issue with lautering and, making a sticky and a stuck mash. But that wasn't the case with the research that we discussed on the Brew Lab, that it didn't really create any issues. But there are differences in the type of mash that you use, like the infusion mash versus the Congress mash, and that causes lautering, or at least it causes beta glucan contents to change. But I will say, like, overall, right? I mean, I think we've been sort of saying we're not looking at a COA, but I still want to brew with high quality malts, right? And I think that's more so of like a home brewer. It's okay to trust your supplier, whereas when you're a commercial brewer, you've got to be a little bit more, checking, right, to make sure that the quality of the malt is actually what you want in your beer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And I'm sure that pro breweries, especially bigger ones, they're reanalyzing the stuff yearly. This is a agricultural crop, right? And so 2022's harvest is going to have different COAs than 2023's. And these are things that especially the larger brewers are having to take a hard look at. But it kind of makes you wonder how many smaller microbreweries, like 10 barrels or so, are kind of more like home brewers, and they just throw it in and it's all good.
Probably a lot, I would guess.
Well, you worked at a brewery. Did Blue Owl look at COAs intensely?
Oh yeah. Anytime they got a shipment in, they would input the new COA numbers whenever they were brewing with that beer. And because it does matter, right? It very much does. You're going to miss your numbers if you're anticipating, 95% extract efficiency, but the shipment that comes in is 92%. That's going to change your beer. And that's the other thing too. As a home brewer, if I'm brewing and I get up to 1050, right, for my OG, doesn't matter because I'm like, oh great, I overshot my OG, no big deal. But if you put a 1050 wort into a fermenter as a commercial brewer, and that ferments down and makes a 5.2% beer versus a 4.5% beer, you've now mislabeled your package, right? So you're actually subject to liability and regulation and all these other things. So making a big difference, making a change in your extract efficiency or what you're putting into the tank actually has downstream implications that you can't do as a brewery. And also, you want it to be consistent, right? If I'm telling you that this beer is 4.5%, I don't want to serve you a 4.9% beer. I'm not sure you'd be able to tell the difference there, but I want it to be consistent, and I want the beer that you get whenever I serve it to you as a commercial brewer to be like the beer that I'm telling you it is. Does that make sense? I don't want you to be shocked or something.
So how do they do that at a professional scale, for a microbrewery? Because as I understand it, they typically don't want to use partial bags, and so they think of everything in bags. And if it's it's 1% off, you can't add 1% of the total grist because then you're getting into new bags. So how do they deal with these things?
Volumes. So it's by water, adding more water, right? So you'll
or less.
Yeah, or less. Exactly. Most of the time it's adding a little bit more water. Yeah, right. More or less, whatever you need to do for the batch. But that's one of the reasons why we're putting that in, at least at Blue Owl. It's when it comes in, the COA gets entered in, so you know exactly what extract you should have. That changes the amount of water that you're going to need to put in, and that way it's just always sort of all ready to go for you, so that you know you're going to hit the right number. You can also change to different things like evaporation rate. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different things you can do. You can also just rack off less wort into the fermenter. So one of the things that the big guys do is high gravity brewing and then trimming. Right. So they'll brew a batch of beer that, maybe is 6 or 7%, and then just add deaerated water to it and then bring it down to 4.5 or 4.6, whatever their target is. That's so that they can hit that target every single time. Right. And they know that the Bud Light or the Budweiser or the Coors or Miller that's coming out is coming out at exactly the ABV that they said it's going to come out as.
Yeah, well, and I understand they're doing that post-fermentation, right? Because in that part, that's a volume game, and that means that they have less, more beer is coming out of a given tank than would otherwise be necessary if they were to make that tank even taller to hold the full strength or net strength beer. But I was talking to a pro brewer buddy in town here, and he was saying that they will kind of overshoot their OG in case they have a less efficient brew day than they were expecting. Then theoretically they're good to go. And if they hit what they thought they would, they just sparge a little more or whatever, water it down, I guess, into the brew kettle. I thought that was an interesting approach to always overshoot just in case, because the other way is just annoying, increasing your boil, adding DME, whatever.
Yeah. That's why I was saying it's almost always, from a commercial brew, it's almost adding more water to dilute, because it's way better to overshoot your gravity than to undershoot it. And so you can always just rack less wort into the fermenter, whatever you need to do. But adding, like you said, increasing your boil time or changing your evaporation rate, adding DME, adding some additional sugar or extract, that takes a lot of effort to do and to calculate that. Yeah.
Yeah. So AKA every brew day I ever have.
Yeah. I was brewing with a guy one time, and we missed our target gravity. I think we undershot it by 3 or 4 points, and he was like, "Aren't you going to put some extract in there?" And I was like, "No, don't worry about it. I'm just going to brew with it. Doesn't matter." But that is something that you can do. But I guess, before we end the end of the show, I mean, we started the show talking about this blue aleurone layer, and then we kind of got off into the weeds about malting barley and COA and what aspects of it are important to us, how to assess different malts. But I did want to circle back to the blue aleurone study that Chris and Pat did, because again, I think this is a case study in assessment for commercial brewers, right? They identified a malt that they thought that they were having trouble with. The commercial brewers decided not to brew with it. So the folks at Oregon State said, hey, let's do a study and see if this works. And that's something that you can apply in your own brewery, right? If you think that you're having some issues or inconsistency from your local homebrew store, from the malt quality, or just your process itself, this is the way that you do it. You don't have to go down and do genetics and all that sort of stuff. But if you have a quality concern, do some experimentation and figure it out, right? I mean, brew a couple of beers and see if they taste different. That's a really easy way to do this sort of assessment. But I wanted to sort of take this back and end on kind of that note, right? I mean, I know you do this in your brewing, Jordan, whenever you're trying to like tweak a recipe or when you're trying to figure out where a problem is. I know you're taking an experimental approach to it, right?
Yeah, and then sometimes it goes on the website.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, totally. We wouldn't be doing this podcast right now if there wasn't a website dedicated to homebrewing experiments, right?
Yeah, and it's just really cool to hear from people that do this for a living about the experiments they're up to. And this is one of those times where it was actually nice to see that there was a non-significant impact.
Yeah. And hey, a pretty easy applying the science episode too, right? I mean, like it was pretty ezy to say like, hey, some barleys have a blue aleurone layer. And in this study, according to what they looked at, it didn't seem to make a difference in terms of malting quality. That was pretty easy science to apply. We didn't go down into the genomics and all the genetics and stuff like that. But if you do want more information on that, just let me know. Be happy to sort you out, or be happy to answer those questions and also hook you up with Chris, who is an expert in those sorts of topics. But Jordan, was there anything else that you wanted to add about malting barley or assessing barley or blue aleurone itself?
I think we did it.
Well, cool. Jordan and I will be back in 2 weeks with our next Applying the Science episode. And until then, be sure to check out the Brewlosophy podcast, the Hop Chronicles Short and Shoddy Brew It Yourself Experiments, and the new Brewlosophy show, all over at brewlosophy.com. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.